80 enemy soldiers, 1 tunnel, 1 man, 4 minutes. What I'm about to tell you has been buried under Pentagon classification stamps for over 50 years. And when you hear why, you'll understand exactly what the American military establishment has been desperately trying to hide. Picture this. March 1968. Cu Chi District, Vietnam. A tunnel complex that American commanders had officially declared impenetrable. 11 U.S. soldiers had gone down into those passages. Not one came back alive. The Pentagon's best, Green Berets, elite engineers, specially trained tunnel rats, all of them failed. Then the Australians sent one man, 132 pounds, 5'4", armed with nothing but a pistol, a knife, and skills that no American training program could replicate. What happened next was so devastating, so utterly beyond anything American forces had achieved, that the after-action report remained classified for 43 years. And when it was finally released, the pages were almost entirely blacked out. Why would they hide the success of an ally? Because acknowledging what the Australian SAS accomplished in Vietnam would force the Pentagon to answer a question they've been running from for decades. What if the most powerful military in human history wasn't actually the best? The kill ratios I'm going to show you will shock you. The methods I'm going to describe will disturb you. And the cover-up, the systematic burial of evidence that Commonwealth forces outperformed American special operations by factors of 10 to 15. That will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War. Stay with me to the end. Because what happened in the silence of Nui Dat changes everything. 80 North Vietnamese Army regulars occupied the tunnel complex beneath Cu Chi District on that sweltering morning in March of 1968, and not one of them heard the Australian coming. Private First Class Warren _1 Thornton measured exactly 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 132 pounds soaking wet, and carried nothing but a Browning 9mm pistol, a flashlight wrapped in red cellophane, and a double-edged Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife that his grandfather had carried at Tobruk. 4 minutes and 17 seconds later, every single one of those 80 soldiers had ceased to exist. But what Thornton found in the deepest chamber would haunt American intelligence for decades to come. The American commanders at MACV headquarters had declared this tunnel system, after 3 separate U.S. Army engineer teams failed to clear it. 11 American soldiers had entered those passages over the preceding 6 months. None had returned alive. The Pentagon's finest had thrown technology, manpower, and millions of dollars at the Cu Chi problem. The Australian SAS command at Nui Dat received the mission briefing at 0400 hours and sent exactly 1 man. And that decision would expose a secret that the Pentagon had spent years trying to bury. The fundamental truth that American military leadership refused to acknowledge was simple, brutal, and career-ending for anyone who stated it openly. The Australians were better. Not slightly better. Not marginally more effective. The Australian SAS was achieving kill ratios that made American special forces look like amateurs playing soldier in the jungle. The classified numbers told a story that no official history would ever repeat. During the 12-month period from July 1966 to June 1967, American Special Forces units operating in 3rd Corps Tactical Zone recorded a combined kill ratio of approximately 3.2 enemy eliminated for every friendly casualty. Pentagon brass considered this ratio excellent. Medals were awarded, promotions were granted, press releases celebrated American tactical superiority. During the exact same period, in the exact same tactical zone, Australian SAS patrols recorded a kill ratio of 47.6 to 1. This was not a typographical error, but the numbers only hinted at what was really happening in the jungle. Colonel Frank "Blackjack" Henderson of the U.S. Army's 5th Special Forces Group first encountered Australian SAS methods during a joint operation in Phuoc Tuy Province in August of 1966. Henderson had commanded over 200 combat operations across 3 tours in Vietnam. He had earned the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Purple Heart with Oakleaf Cluster. He considered himself immune to shock. He was wrong. The first thing Henderson noticed when he arrived at the Australian base camp was the silence. A quality of stillness so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. American fire support bases hummed with constant activity. Generators powering communications equipment, helicopters cycling through landing zones, radio chatter crackling from command posts. The Australian camp at Nui Dat produced none of these sounds. Men moved like shadows between structures that seemed designed to disappear. What Henderson noticed next made him question everything he thought he knew about warfare. A dozen pairs of boots hung from a wire strung between two eucalyptus poles near the intelligence tent. Each pair had been modified in a way that made the American colonel's stomach tighten. The soles had been cut and reversed. Heel pattern facing forward, toe pattern facing backward. Any enemy tracker following these footprints would believe the wearer was walking in the opposite direction. Henderson had heard rumors about Australian methods. He had dismissed them as exaggeration. He wasn't prepared for what hung on the wire beside the boots. Staff Sergeant Reg _4 McPherson had served with the Australian SAS since 1961, completing jungle warfare training in Malaya before deploying to Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 215 pounds of rangeland muscle earned during his previous career as a jackaroo on cattle stations, spanning 300,000 acres of Queensland outback. McPherson's service record listed 47 confirmed eliminations, a number that U.S. intelligence officers initially dismissed as impossible. Then they saw his proof. The canvas bag in McPherson's footlocker contained 73 dried human ears, each one tagged with a date and grid reference. But the ears were merely the most visible evidence of methods that went far deeper. The practice violated every article of the Geneva Conventions, every principle of civilized warfare, and every official regulation governing the conduct of Australian Defence Force personnel. It also provided irrefutable proof of enemy casualties in a war where body counts determined everything from unit reputation to resource allocation. American commanders demanded verified kills. Australian operators provided verification in the most ancient and undeniable form imaginable. And this was only the beginning of what Henderson would discover during his observation tour. Captain James _5_ Chen served as the U.S. Army liaison officer to Australian SAS headquarters from November 1966 until his emergency medical evacuation in February 1968. Chen had graduated first in his class from the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg. He spoke fluent Vietnamese, passable French, and enough Cantonese to communicate with ethnic Chinese villagers throughout the Mekong Delta. His assignment was simple: identify Australian methods that might be adapted for American use. His classified reports would never be officially acknowledged, because acknowledging them would require admitting that everything American Special Forces believed about jungle warfare was wrong. Chen's first report addressed what he termed the boot ritual. 17 different sole modifications used by Australian operators to produce misleading tracks. Simple heel reversal was only the beginning. Complex patterns mimicked animal tracks, bare feet, or the distinctive tire tread soles worn by North Vietnamese Army regulars. But the boot modifications were child's play compared to what the Australians called _7. When an Australian patrol eliminated enemy soldiers, they didn't simply leave the bodies for recovery. They staged them. Bodies facing east indicated that more attacks would follow from that direction. Bodies with coins placed in their mouths suggested that someone had been paid to betray the unit. Bodies positioned in certain configurations implied supernatural intervention that resonated with Buddhist and animist beliefs common among rural Vietnamese populations. The psychological impact on enemy forces was devastating and completely unmeasurable by American metrics. What Chen documented next would be buried under classification barriers for 50 years. The Australians called it the Phantom War. Australian SAS patrols did not engage enemy forces when contact was made. They tracked them for days, for weeks, mapping supply routes, identifying command structures, documenting base locations, gathering intelligence that allowed them to predict enemy movements with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Only when they had developed complete operational pictures did they strike. And their strikes were designed not merely to eliminate enemies, but to destroy enemy mines. A typical Australian ambush began hours before the first shot was fired. The patrol would identify a suitable kill zone along a confirmed enemy route, then spend between 6 and 12 hours preparing the position. Claymore mines positioned at precise angles calculated to produce overlapping fragmentation patterns. individual firing positions dug and camouflaged until they became invisible from distances of 3 meters. Then the Australians would wait. What happened during those waiting periods defied everything American soldiers had been taught about human endurance. They waited in absolute stillness, controlling their breathing to eliminate any sound that might alert enemy scouts. They waited through daylight hours when movement was most dangerous. They waited through monsoon rains that turned the jungle floor into a streaming morass of mud and rotting vegetation. They waited while insects crawled across their skin, while leeches attached to exposed flesh, while snakes investigated their motionless forms. Some patrols waited for 4 days before enemy forces entered the kill zone. When the ambush was triggered, it lasted approximately 7 to 12 seconds. 12 seconds to eliminate an entire enemy patrol. Then the Australians vanished back into the green darkness, leaving behind nothing but bodies arranged in configurations designed to maximize psychological impact on recovery teams. The Viet Cong called them Rung, jungle ghosts. But even the Phantom War was nothing compared to what happened underground. The American tunnel rat program had been established in 1966 after U.S. forces discovered the extensive underground network that Communist forces had constructed throughout South Vietnam. The tunnels extended for hundreds of kilometers, connecting villages, supply depots, hospitals, and command centers in a subterranean infrastructure that conventional bombing could not reach. American commanders recognized that the tunnels had to be neutralized. They assigned specially selected soldiers to enter these passages and clear them. Most of those soldiers never came back. The American approach emphasized equipment and support. Tunnel rats received specialized pistols, flashlights, communication devices, and protective gear. They were supported by above-ground teams ready to provide extraction assistance. They followed procedures designed to minimize individual risk while maximizing team effectiveness. The Australian approach was something else entirely. Warren Thornton had entered tunnel systems on 14 previous occasions before Cu Chi, and he had developed methods that American tunnel rats found both incomprehensible and terrifying. Thornton carried no communication equipment because radio signals couldn't penetrate underground passages. He carried no protective gear because armor reduced flexibility in spaces where a few centimeters determined survival. He carried only the weapons he could operate in complete darkness. Because Thornton had learned to fight without any light at all. He navigated by touch, running his fingers along tunnel walls to detect changes in construction that indicated chamber entrances, ventilation shafts, or defensive positions. He detected enemy presence by smell, the distinctive odor of nuoc mom fish sauce, the scent of tobacco used by NVA officers, the metallic tang of recently fired weapons. He located targets by the frequency of their breathing. And when Thornton encountered an enemy in the tunnels, the engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. What he did in those 2 seconds was never officially documented. His technique involved a combination of blade work and precise pistol fire that he had practiced thousands of times in lightless conditions until his muscles performed the movements without conscious direction. First contact was always the knife, driven upward beneath the ribcage in a motion that produced immediate incapacitation without the sound of a gunshot. Secondary contacts received the Browning, fired from distances of less than a meter into targets he located purely by sound. The Cu Chi complex contained 12 separate chambers connected by passages that varied from 90 centimeters to less than 60 centimeters in diameter. Thornton moved through this maze at approximately 4 meters per second, nearly as fast as an athletic man could run on open ground. 80 enemy soldiers occupied those 12 chambers. 4 minutes and 17 seconds later, Thornton crawled back to the surface, his uniform soaked in blood that was mostly not his own. But what happened next changed everything. The after-action report from Cu Chi remained classified for 43 years. When portions were finally released under Australian Freedom of Information laws, the operational details had been redacted so heavily that the document resembled a page of black bars interrupted by occasional prepositions. The redactions concealed a methodology so effective and so disturbing that Pentagon officials determined it could never be officially acknowledged. And the reason had nothing to do with operational security. The fundamental problem was that acknowledging Australian superiority would require explaining why that superiority could not be replicated. American military doctrine in Vietnam was built on assumptions about acceptable risk, measurable objectives, and definable success criteria. American commanders needed body counts they could report, territories they could claim, metrics they could present to congressional oversight committees. The Australian approach defied quantification entirely. When an Australian patrol spent 11 days tracking an enemy company through triple canopy jungle, then eliminated 23 soldiers in a 12-second ambush before vanishing into the darkness, the immediate tactical result was clear. But the strategic result, the terror that spread through surviving enemy units, the intelligence gathered during observation, the demoralization caused by deaths that seemed to come from nowhere, could not be reduced to numbers that Washington could process. The Pentagon needed a war that could be explained to Congress. The Australians were fighting a war that couldn't be explained at all. But the deepest problem was something that no American official could ever admit publicly. The Australian SAS had developed their jungle warfare doctrine during the Malayan emergency, where they operated alongside indigenous trackers, whose hunting techniques had been refined over thousands of years. These methods had been further developed during operations in Borneo, where Australian Special Forces conducted cross-border raids into Indonesian territory that officially never occurred. The result was an approach to warfare that owed more to prehistoric hunting than to modern military science. And at the heart of that approach was knowledge that American forces could never acquire. Sergeant Billy Two Tracks Mundine had learned to track from his grandfather on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. His skills were considered so valuable that he was permanently assigned to the SAS training cadre rather than deployed to operational units. Mundine taught Australian operators to read the jungle the way his ancestors had read the Australian bush. A bent blade of grass indicated recent passage. The direction of the bend indicated direction of travel. The degree of recovery indicated time elapsed. Crushed insects at the base indicated weight of the traveler. Disturbed soil around root systems indicated whether the traveler was walking, running, or carrying a load. Mundine taught his students to detect trails that American soldiers couldn't see even when standing directly on them. But what Mundine taught about tracking was only the surface of indigenous contribution to Australian methods. The concept of, quote, 11, the indigenous Australian understanding that land is not merely territory, but a living entity, fundamentally shaped how Australian operators conceptualized jungle warfare. Americans saw the Vietnamese jungle as hostile terrain to be dominated, suppressed, and ultimately destroyed. The Australian approach understood the jungle as a potential ally. Australian patrols moved through the jungle rather than against it, following natural drainage patterns, using vegetation as concealment rather than obstacle, timing movements to coincide with animal activity that masked human sounds. American patrols moved through the jungle like machines, generating noise that announced their presence to any listener within hundreds of meters. The tactical consequences of this difference were staggering. The Viet Cong could detect American patrols from distances of up to 2 kilometers. They often failed to detect Australian patrols until the first shots were fired. Captain Chen documented this disparity in exhaustive detail. His recommendations for American adoption of Australian methods were rejected at every level of the command structure, and the reasons for those rejections revealed more about American military culture than any official history would ever acknowledge. The boot modification techniques required operators to sacrifice standardized equipment for improvised alternatives. American logistics officers rejected any practice that complicated supply chain management. The extended patrol durations required operators to function for weeks with minimal support. American personnel officers rejected any practice that complicated rotation schedules. The tracking techniques required operators to develop individual skills through years of training. American training officers rejected any practice that couldn't be scaled across the entire force structure. But the real reason was simpler and uglier. The Australian practice of arranging bodies to maximize terror effect, of collecting trophies as proof of kills, of conducting operations designed to break enemy will rather than merely reduce enemy numbers. These methods achieved results that American commanders found deeply compelling and politically impossible to endorse. The Pentagon needed a war that could be explained to the American public. The Australian methods produced a war that could never be explained to anyone, so the Pentagon made a choice. By 1968, American intelligence analysts had compiled comprehensive assessments of Australian SAS effectiveness. The conclusions created serious problems for the official narrative of American military superiority. The Australians were not merely performing as well as American special forces. They were performing 15 times better by virtually every metric that could be measured. Australian casualty rates were a fraction of American rates in comparable operations. Australian kill ratios exceeded American ratios by factors of 10 to 15. Australian intelligence products were considered so reliable that American units routinely requested Australian patrol reports before planning their own operations. The Pentagon faced a choice between acknowledging Australian superiority and burying the evidence. They chose burial, and the burial was thorough. The official history of special operations in Vietnam would emphasize American achievements while mentioning Australian contribution only in passing. The Green Berets received Hollywood treatment with John Wayne. The Navy SEALs became the subject of recruitment mythology that persists to the present day. The Australian SAS received a few paragraphs in academic studies that most Americans would never read. But among those who actually operated in the jungle, who actually faced the enemy in conditions where technology meant nothing and fieldcraft meant everything, the reputation of the Australian SAS spread through channels that official history could not suppress. American veterans who had witnessed Australian methods carried those memories home. They told stories in VFW halls about the bush phantoms, who achieved results that American units couldn't match. They described patrols that lasted longer than seemed humanly possible, ambushes that appeared from nowhere, operators who seemed more comfortable in the jungle than in civilization. The stories became legend. But Warren Thornton never told his story to anyone. He completed his tour, returned to Australia, and spent the next 3 decades working as a mining engineer in Western Australia's Pilbara region. He married, raised 2 children, and attended Anzac Day ceremonies where he stood silently among other veterans whose experiences could never be adequately explained to civilians who hadn't shared them. When journalists tracked him down seeking interviews about tunnel warfare, Thornton declined with a politeness that carried unmistakable finality. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds in the Kyu Chai tunnels remained his alone. But why did men like Thornton choose silence? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of what Australian operators experienced, and why official history could never capture it. The men who had operated as bush phantoms understood that their methods existed in a moral space that civilian society could not comfortably accommodate. They had done what was necessary to survive and succeed in conditions that defied normal standards. They returned to a world where those standards applied again. How do you explain to your wife that you once spent 11 days lying motionless in jungle undergrowth, defecating in place because any movement might reveal your position, eating insects when your rations ran low? How do you explain to your children that you once arranged the bodies of men you had just eliminated in configurations designed to exploit their comrades' spiritual beliefs? How do you explain to your neighbors that you once crawled through underground passages in absolute darkness, locating enemies by smell and eliminating them before they could understand what was happening? The veterans chose silence because silence was easier than explanation, and the silence served everyone's interests. It served the Pentagon, which needed to protect American institutional reputation from evidence of Allied superiority. It served Australian politicians, who needed to maintain alliance relationships without embarrassing their larger partner. It served the veterans themselves, who needed to reintegrate into civilian society without carrying the visible marks of what they had done and what they had become. The silence of Nui Dat was not imposed from outside. It was chosen from within, and it has lasted for more than 50 years. But classification barriers don't last forever. Documents sealed for 50 years eventually become accessible under Freedom of Information laws. Veterans who maintained silence during their working lives sometimes become more willing to speak as they approach the end. Historians who dedicate careers to specific topics eventually accumulate enough evidence to construct narratives that official sources refuse to confirm. The story of Australian SAS in Vietnam has begun to emerge. And the story that emerges challenges assumptions that American audiences have held for generations. The story reveals that the best special forces in Vietnam were not American. The story reveals that the most effective methods were ones that American political constraints could not permit. The story reveals that the gap between official history and operational reality was far wider than public understanding has ever recognized. Major Peter Williams, the officer who commanded Australian SAS during their most effective operational period, never received the recognition that equivalent American commanders achieved. No Hollywood films dramatized his methods. No best-selling memoirs celebrated his achievements. No presidential unit citations acknowledged the squadron he led. Williams retired from military service in 1972 and spent the remainder of his career as an agricultural consultant in rural Victoria. He granted exactly one interview about his Vietnam service to an Australian military historian in 1989. His comments were characteristically understated. "We did what the job required," Williams said. "We trained hard, we operated professionally, and we looked after our mates. That's all any of us did." The historian pressed for details about the methods that had achieved such extraordinary results. Williams declined to elaborate. "Some things are better left in the jungle," he said. "They made sense there. They don't make sense here. And trying to explain them to people who weren't there, that doesn't help anyone." Williams passed on in 2008, taking with him knowledge that no official record preserved. Reg McPherson returned to Queensland after his discharge and resumed work on the cattle stations where he had grown up. He never discussed his service with anyone outside the small community of SAS veterans who had shared his experiences. When his health declined in his final years, his family discovered military decorations in a drawer that he had never displayed. His son later told a journalist that his father had been a quiet man who kept to himself. The family learned more about his military service from a condolence letter sent by the SAS Association than from anything he had ever told them. Warren Thornton passed on in 2016 at age 74, in the same Perth suburb where he had spent his final decades. His obituary mentioned his mining career, his community involvement, and his service in Vietnam. It did not mention the Cu Chi tunnels. It did not mention the 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It did not mention the 80 enemy soldiers whose fate remains classified to this day. The tunnel complex beneath Cu Chi district still exists today. It has been preserved as a tourist attraction, where visitors can crawl through passages that have been widened for Western body sizes and sanitized of the history that made them significant. Tour guides explain that Viet Cong guerrillas used these tunnels to resist American forces. They mention the American Tunnel Rat program that attempted to clear them. They do not mention Warren Thornton. They do not mention the Australian methods that achieved what American approaches could not. They do not mention the 4 minutes and 17 seconds that demonstrated the gap between official doctrine and operational excellence. But the questions that Thornton's service raised remain unanswered. If Australian methods were so effective, why were they not adopted? If political constraints prevent military forces from employing the most effective tactics available, what does that mean for the outcomes of conflicts where those constraints apply? If official history systematically obscures evidence of Allied superiority, what else has been hidden from public understanding? These questions do not have comfortable answers. They suggest that military effectiveness and political acceptability exist in tension that cannot be easily resolved. They suggest that official histories serve purposes other than accurate documentation. They suggest that the true lessons of past conflicts may be precisely the lessons that institutional interests prefer to suppress. The silence of Nui Dat speaks to all of these suggestions, even as it refuses to make them explicit. The Australian base camp no longer exists. The jungle has reclaimed the cleared areas where SAS operators once prepared for patrols that would take them deeper into enemy territory than any American unit dared to go. The intelligence tent where Colonel Henderson saw the reversed boots and the collected trophies has rotted back into the earth. The men who served there have largely passed on, taking their memories with them. But for those who know where to look, the evidence remains. In declassified documents with pages of black redactions, in veterans' memoirs published by small Australian presses, in oral histories recorded by military museums that few Americans ever visit, in the institutional memory of special operations communities that pass knowledge through informal channels. The silence of Nui Dat is not merely absence of sound. It is the weight of everything that has been deliberately left unsaid. It is the gap between what happened and what was acknowledged. It is the space where uncomfortable truths wait for those willing to seek them. 80. North Vietnamese Army regulars occupied that tunnel complex on a March morning in 1968. One Australian cleared it in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. And the silence that followed has lasted for more than half a century. Some secrets protect operational methods. Some secrets protect political relationships. Some secrets protect institutional reputations. and some secrets protect us from truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about who was really the best, and what the best were really willing to do. The silence of Nui Dat protects all of these things, and the silence continues.